This video will walk you through the introduction to the Color of Chemistry lab, and also just practice some predicting products and determining which one is your precipitate. So the first part of this page is just a kind of step-by-step review of how to predict products for precipitation reactions. So I have 3 here that I'm going to do for you, just to kind of remind you and do a little review from yesterday's lesson. So one thing to remember is that when we have 2 compounds that are ionic, or any compound that is ionic, when they separate, or when they're added to water, they're going to dissociate and separate into individual ions. And so it's important to know their charges. So not only are you going to need access to your polyatomic ion reference sheet, but you're also going to need access to just the general reference sheet that has charges for just your ions that are located on the periodic table. And both of those are found in the on the references page for the general class information. So for our first step that we're going to do for number 1 is I'm just going to kind of write down my ions. And I want to make sure, because I want to make sure I know their charges. Because like I said, that is very important when we get ready to predict our products. So the first thing I do is separate out my ions and my charges. Notice I do have a polyatomic ion here, NO3. So I've looked at my polyatomic reference sheet and I found its charge is 1-. So that's a nitrate ion with a 1- charge. Remember, it acts like one thing because it's a polyatomic ion. I do not separate it. So in a double replacement reaction, the easiest way to predict your products is to just take your first elements or your cations, okay, and we are just going to swap their places. Okay, so whereas originally I had silver with nitrate, this time I'm going to have potassium. Remember, potassium has a 1+, and I still have my nitrate ion there. Then with my chlorine, it's going to be silver. That's a 1+, and then there's my chloride ion. So now that I have swapped my cations, my next thing I'm going to do is write my formula. And remember, we can write a formula by writing our symbols, and then we can use the crisscross method. So our numbers, not our charges, but our numbers are just going to crisscross down to the element, the next element in the compound. So my products would be a K for potassium, and then this 1 from nitrate is going to crisscross down. But remember, 1s are invisible, so I do not have to write it. So I'm just going to write the NO3 next, and then this 1 is going to crisscross down to the bottom. Remember, I don't have to write an invisible 1. Next, I have silver, Ag, and then the 1 from chlorine is going to crisscross down. I don't have to write it because it is invisible. And then the 1 from silver is going to crisscross down below chlorine. And again, I do not have to write it because it is invisible. So there's my 2 final products. If I look at number 4, I've double checked. I have everything there. So I still have silver, a nitrate ion, a potassium, and a chlorine. I didn't leave anything out. So my next step here is to look at my solubility rules. Okay, so I'm going to look at my rules and I'm going to try to determine if I'm going to write an AQ for soluble or an S for insoluble. So the easiest thing to do is to always look at your last, like your anion. Usually your rules are listed by the anions. So if this is an NO3, this is a nitrate. So if I look at rule number 2, it says nitrates are soluble. So that means I'm going to put an AQ for soluble. That means it's dissolved in solution. Next, I'm going to look for Cl for chlorides. Chlorides is rule number 3, and it says most chlorides are soluble except silver and a few other ones. So because silver is an exception, it is not soluble, I'm going to put an S. Okay, so an S is for insoluble because that's what's going to form that solid at the end of your reaction. Okay. Next, I would balance. That would be step 6. In this case, this equation's already balanced, so I don't have to do anything extra. That is my answer. Okay, I'm going to do one more. So remember, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to write out my ions. Remember, OH is a hydroxide. Okay, and remember, I've gotten those charges from my periodic table and from my polyatomic reference sheet. And so if I look now, now my next step is to swap out my cations. So I'm just going to swap. So instead of potassium at the beginning, I'm going to have calcium. And I'm still going to have my OH hydroxide. Then I'm going to have the potassium over here with the chlorine. Okay, and now I'm ready to write my formula. So here's where I'm going to get ready to crisscross. So calcium, the 1 from hydroxide is going to come down. It's invisible. I don't have to write it. In this case, the 2 is going to crisscross down below to the hydroxide ion. Remember, since this is a polyatomic, I have to have my parentheses because the 2 is for the entire ion. And then here, KCl, they're both 1, so when they crisscross, they are invisible. Okay, so that's step 4. I've double checked. I have everything. If you do it this way, you're not going to forget anything. If you write it out by your ions, draw your arrow, and crisscross. So next we need to look at our solubility rules. So this first compound is a hydroxide. Okay, so the last rule says that hydroxide are insoluble. So if it's insoluble, right, that means it's not going to dissolve, so it's going to be a solid. That's where my S is going to go. And then chlorides, again, are rule number 3, and it says they are soluble. So that gets an AQ for aqueous. In this case, I would need to balance my equation. So if I look, I have, let me get a different color so it's not so jumbled. Here I have 1 hydroxide. Here I have 2. So I need a 2 in the front. That changes my number of potassiums. It means I need a 2 on this side. That means I have 2 chlorines here and I have 2 chlorines here, so those are balanced. And remember, there's invisible 1s in front of my other elements. Okay, last one, and I'm going to do this one a little bit quicker, but I just want you to be able to see it so you can do your own at the end of the lab. So I'm referencing my polyatomic for the sulfate and my periodic table for my sodium. Once I write my charges, I know I can flip-flop my first cations, my first elements. Don't forget to bring your charges with you because the charges are what determine your subscripts. Now I'm ready to write my formulas. So here, since they're both 2 plus and 2 minus, okay, even when I go to drop them down or crisscross them, they're going to cancel out because they're the same. So your formula just ends up being BaSO4, barium sulfate, and then sodium bromide, they're both a 1, so they're both invisible. Now I'm ready to look at my solubility rules. So sulfates, SO4, remember it's the easiest way to do this is look at your anion and to find it on the list. So it says sulfates are soluble except barium. So Ba is barium. So because this is an except, that means it's going to be insoluble. It's going to have an S after it. And then my bromides are soluble. I don't think it's going to be listed as in this case, it's not listed as a bromide on your sheet because it's listed with rule number 1 where it says sodium, potassium, ammonium are all soluble. So anytime you have any kind of sodium, it's always going to be aqueous, and that is a Q. Okay, so if you don't see the anion, it's probably that rule number 1 where it's talking about sodium, potassium, and ammonia. All right, and then this, I need to balance. That's my last step. So over here I have 2 sodiums, so I need a 2 in front of this sodium. That means now I have 2 bromines. I have 2 bromines over here. I have 1 SO4, 1 SO4, 1 barium, 1 barium. Remember, this SO4 is a polyatomic, right? So I can treat it like one thing when I'm balancing. It does not mean I have 4 SO4s. The 4 is part of that entire ion, okay? So don't get confused when you're balancing. Make sure you're keeping that together, okay? So you can think about it like it has parentheses on it. Once you finish this, then you are done with the first part of this